October 3, 1945. Camp John Hay, Baguio, Philippines. Dawn light filters through pine trees onto a converted recreation hall where 78 Japanese women sit in perfect rows on wooden benches, their hands folded precisely in their laps. These are not ordinary prisoners, they are teachers, nurses, telephone operators, and clerks who had served the Imperial Japanese forces across the Philippines, now gathered in what they believe will be another day of silent waiting. The morning air carries the scent of pine needles and coffee from the American mess hall nearby. Then something unprecedented occurs. Lieutenant Margaret Williams, a Women's Army co-education officer from Kansas, enters carrying an armload of books, not military manuals or propaganda materials, but English primers, dictionaries, and remarkably, novels. She sets them on a makeshift desk and writes on a salvaged blackboard in careful letters, "English class all welcome." The chalk, that simple stick of compressed powder, squeaks against the board with a sound that will echo through these women's lives for decades to come. 23-year-old Suzuki Haruko, a former elementary school teacher from Osaka who had been forcibly recruited to teach Japanese to Filipino children, later wrote in her memoir, "We thought it was a trick, a test of loyalty, a trap." In Japan, prisoners learning the enemy's language would be considered traitors preparing for collaboration. But the American woman just stood there, smiling, holding out the chalk to us like it was the most natural thing in the world. The prohibition against enemy language acquisition had been absolute in Imperial Japan. Learning English beyond military necessity was viewed as ideological contamination, a gateway to dangerous thoughts that might weaken the Japanese spirit. The military government had banned English instruction in schools by 1943, removing even technical terms from textbooks. English books were burned in public ceremonies. Citizens caught with English materials faced interrogation and potential imprisonment for harboring enemy thoughts. Yet here were American captors not just permitting but actively encouraging their Japanese prisoners to learn English, providing materials and instruction at no cost, with no apparent ulterior motive beyond education itself. The chalk in Lieutenant Williams' hand represented more than a writing implement. It symbolized the democratization of knowledge, the radical idea that information and education should flow freely regardless of national boundaries or prisoner status. These Japanese women had existed in an information ecosystem designed for control rather than enlightenment. Education in wartime Japan served the state's purposes exclusively. Language was a tool of empire. Japanese was to be imposed on conquered territories, while foreign languages were restricted to military specialists who needed them for intelligence purposes. Civilian women, regardless of their education level, were excluded from foreign language learning as it was deemed unnecessary for their roles as mothers and supporters of the empire. Yoshida Michiko, who had worked as a telephone operator connecting military calls across the Philippines, testified years later, "I had secretly wondered what the American voices were saying on the lines I connected, but wondering was dangerous. Curiosity about the enemy was treason. Now the enemy was teaching us their words, wanting us to understand them. My mind could not process this reversal." The first English lesson began with Lieutenant Williams writing her name on the board and pronouncing it slowly. She then gestured for each woman to say their own name. This simple act, speaking their names aloud to an American, carried profound psychological weight. In Japanese military culture, individual identity was subsumed into collective identity. These women had been numbers, functions, roles, never individuals with names worth knowing. As each woman hesitantly spoke her name and Williams repeated it, trying to get the pronunciation correct, a subtle shift occurred. They were being recognized as individuals worthy of being known, understood, communicated with. The chalk passed from hand to hand as women wrote their names in Roman letters. Many for the first time in their lives. The books Williams had brought revealed American assumptions about education that stood in sharp contrast to Japanese practices. Instead of ideological texts or military manuals, there were children's picture books, simple novels, magazines, and incredibly, books written by women authors. A Japanese woman reading an American woman's thoughts. This concept violated multiple taboos simultaneously. When Williams opened a book by Paul Buck, explaining that this American woman had written about Asia and won the Nobel Prize, several Japanese women audibly gasped. Tanaka Yoriko, a nurse who had served in military hospitals, later recalled, "A woman writing books that the whole world read, a woman winning prizes for her thoughts." And the Americans were proud of this, not ashamed. The chalk in my hand felt suddenly heavier, like it might write things I had never imagined writing. The voluntary nature of the classes created its own confusion. Attendance was not mandatory. No role was taken. Women could come and go as they pleased. This freedom of choice in education was entirely foreign to Japanese women who had lived under compulsory education systems designed to create imperial subjects. The first day, many attended expecting punishment for those who didn't appear. When no punishment came, when Williams simply began teaching those who were present without commenting on absences, another paradigm shattered. Education as choice rather than compulsion. Learning as opportunity rather than obligation. These concepts required fundamental reconceptualization of what education meant. Why the second week of October, the English classes had evolved into something unprecedented, a cultural exchange. Williams encouraged the women to teach her Japanese words in return for English lessons. The chalk moved in both directions across the cultural divide. When Suzuki Haruka wrote the Japanese character for Peace Heiwa and explained its components, Williams copied it carefully and asked about its philosophical implications. This reciprocal learning violated every principle of prisoner-captor relationships that Japanese women had been taught to expect. They were not being interrogated for useful information, but engaged as cultural educators. The chalk traced characters from both languages on the same board, creating a visual representation of cultural dialogue rather than domination. The content of English lessons revealed American values through vocabulary choices. Williams taught words like choice, opinion, individual, rights, freedom, concepts that existed in Japanese but carried different weights and implications. When she explained the word vote, using the example of American women gaining suffrage in 1920, the Japanese women struggled to comprehend. Nakamura Keika, a clerk who had managed supply requisitions, asked through an interpreter if Williams meant that common women, not just nobility, could influence government. When Williams confirmed this, explaining she had voted in the 1944 election, the chalk in Nakamura's hand stopped moving mid-character. She later wrote, "I had to relearn not just English words but the entire universe they described." The chalk became a tool of liberation in unexpected ways. Women began writing questions they were too embarrassed to ask aloud. "Why do Americans educate enemies?" appeared on the board one morning before class. Williams' response, written in simple English with Japanese translation help from a Nisei sergeant, explained American beliefs about education as a human right, literacy as freedom's foundation, and knowledge as something that multiplied when shared rather than diminished. These philosophical discussions, conducted through chalk on blackboard, introduced concepts of positive sum, rather than zero-sum thinking that fundamentally challenged Japanese wartime ideology. Statistical records from Camp John Hay reveal the extraordinary uptake of English education among Japanese women prisoners. Within 1 month, attendance had grown from 31 to 67 regular participants. By November, women were requesting additional materials, forming study groups, and creating their own learning aids. The military supplies officer reported requisitioning over 200 pounds of chalk in 6 weeks, more than the entire men's camp had used in 6 months. The women were not just learning English. They were documenting their learning, creating dictionaries, writing practice sentences, and most remarkably, beginning to write personal narratives in English about their experiences. The transformation manifested in small behavioral changes. Women began greeting American guards with good morning instead of silent bows. They started reading English labels on supplies, asking questions about unfamiliar words. Some began translating Japanese songs into English, struggling with metaphors that didn't cross cultural boundaries. The chalk dust on their hands became a badge of effort, a sign of minds expanding beyond prescribed limits. Sergeant Patricia Moore, who assisted Williams, noted, "These women went from avoiding eye contact to asking me to check their pronunciation." The hunger for learning, once unleashed, was insatiable. An unexpected development occurred in late October when Williams introduced the concept of creative writing. She asked the women to write simple stories in English about their childhood memories, explicitly non-military, non-political topics. This request to generate original content rather than copy or translate existing text represented another paradigm shift. In Japanese education, creativity was subordinated to memorization and repetition. Original thought, especially from women, was neither encouraged nor valued. Yet here was an American teacher asking for their individual memories, their personal narratives, their unique perspectives. The chalk hesitated in many hands before tentatively beginning to write. When I was small, my grandmother's garden, the sound of temple bells, the stories that emerged revealed humanity obscured by years of militaristic conditioning. Yamada Tomoko wrote about catching fireflies with her siblings. Itio Sadeko described her mother's kimono shop. Watanabe Yuki recalled learning to play the koto. As Williams read these stories aloud with permission, correcting grammar while praising content, something profound occurred. These women were hearing their own experiences valued, their memories treated as worthy of preservation and sharing. The chalk had become a tool for recovering individual identity from collective submersion. Each story written was a small act of self-assertion, a claim that personal experience mattered. The ripple effects extended beyond the classroom. Women who attended English classes began teaching others in the barracks. Chalk appeared on walls, floors, any surface that could hold writing, as women practiced English letters and words. An underground economy developed around English learning materials. Women traded belongings for dictionaries, exchanged labor for tutoring, created hand-copied textbooks. The American administration, rather than suppressing this informal educational network, supplied additional chalk and paper. This response, supporting rather than controlling spontaneous learning, further confounded Japanese expectations of authority. November brought an even more radical development. Williams introduced American literature written by women. When she read excerpts from Emily Dickinson's poetry, translating key phrases with help from increasingly capable students, the impact was seismic. Here was a woman from the previous century writing about death, immortality, and individual perception with authority and artistic power. The line, "I'm nobody, who are you?" translated and discussed, resonated with women who had been trained to be nobody, to disappear into roles and functions. The chalk in their hands began writing not just English words, but English thoughts, individual questioning, assertive thoughts that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The Japanese military personnel at Camp John Hay included male officers in a separate section who watched the women's transformation with alarm. Colonel Ishii complained through interpreters that the English education was destroying Japanese feminine virtue and corrupting proper thinking. His specific objection revealed the threat. Educated women might question authority, might think independently, might resist returning to subordinate roles. The American response was to offer English classes to the men as well. When they refused, viewing it as collaboration, the contrast became stark. The women were choosing education, while the men were choosing ignorance to preserve ideological purity. The chalk continued moving in female hands while male hands remained clenched in resistance. The examination Williams administered in December wasn't a test in the traditional sense, but a demonstration of progress. Women were asked to write letters in English to imaginary American friends, describing their hopes for the future. These letters, preserved in occupation archives, reveal remarkable transformation. Suzuki Haruka wrote, "I hope to become teacher again, but different teacher. Teacher who teaches students to think, not just remember. Teacher who says, 'What is your opinion?' Not 'this is correct answer.'" The chalk had taught more than language. It had taught the possibility of different pedagogical philosophies. Different relationships between knowledge and authority, cross-cultural understanding emerged through linguistic exploration. When Williams struggled to explain the concept of privacy, a word with no direct Japanese equivalent, it led to discussions about individual versus collective rights that challenged fundamental assumptions on both sides. Japanese women taught Williams about concepts like wa harmony and gaman, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity that had no English equivalents. The chalk traced these untranslatable concepts on the board, creating bridges between worldviews previously thought incompatible. Each language lesson became a philosophy seminar, each new word a window into different ways of organizing human experience. The notebooks these women filled with English lessons became treasured possessions. Unlike military documents or official papers, these were records of personal growth, individual achievement, chosen learning. Matsuda Akiko, who had been a telephone operator, created a dictionary of over 500 words, each carefully defined and used in original sentences. Her notebook, donated decades later to a peace museum, shows the evolution of her handwriting from tentative copying to confident original composition. The chalk dust embedded in the pages testifies to hours of practice, of minds refusing to remain confined within prescribed limits. Personal transformation manifested in career aspirations previously unimaginable. women began expressing desires to become interpreters, teachers, writers, journalists, professions requiring English skills, but more importantly, requiring individual voice and authority. Takahashi Miko, who had been a military nurse, wrote in her December letter, "I want to study medicine in English books. I want to read what whole world knows, not just what Japan allows. The chalk has shown me doors I didn't know existed." This expansion of professional imagination represented the most profound challenge to Japanese women's prescribed roles they were envisioning. Futures as knowledge workers. Not just wives and mothers, the men's camp resistance to English education created an unexpected consequence. As women gained language skills, they became valuable to the occupation administration for translation and interpretation. Several were hired as civilian employees, earning wages and gaining professional experience, while male military personnel remained imprisoned in their linguistic isolation. The chalk had become a key to economic opportunity, a tool for building post-war careers that would have been impossible without English skills. The gender reversal, women advancing through education while men stagnated through resistance, challenged every assumption about capability and adaptability. Christmas 1945 brought an extraordinary moment. The women's English class performed a reading of adapted Christmas stories, including A Christmas Carol, with its themes of transformation and redemption. Hearing Japanese women read Dickens in accented but comprehensible English, American gods and administrators witnessed the power of educational exchange. Lieutenant Williams cried openly as Suzuki Haruko read Tiny Tim's God Bless Us, everyone in English, then explained its meaning in Japanese to her fellow prisoners. The chalk had built bridges that politics and war had seemed to make impossible. The repatriation process in early 1946 revealed how profoundly the English education had changed these women. Many requested English books to take back to Japan. Some asked for letters of recommendation for English teaching positions. Others sought connections to American universities that might accept Japanese students. The chalk they had held for a few months had rewritten their life trajectories. Williams provided what she could: book donations, reference letters, contact information for educational institutions. These gestures, small in themselves, represented investments in individual futures that transcended national conflicts. The final English class in February 1946 was emotional beyond description. Women who had arrived as silent prisoners left as English speakers, writers, thinkers who had discovered their own voices. Williams gave each woman a piece of chalk as a parting gift, a simple gesture that carried profound symbolism. This wasn't just a writing implement, but a tool of intellectual liberation, a reminder that learning could continue, that minds could remain open, that education was a choice they could continue making. Many women reported keeping that piece of chalk for decades, a tangible reminder of transformation. The letters these women sent to Williams over subsequent years, archived in the Women's Army Corps Museum, document the long-term impact of those English lessons. Suzuki Haruko became an English professor at a Japanese women's college, pioneering communicative teaching methods that encouraged student opinion and creativity. Yoshida Michiko worked as an interpreter for international organizations, facilitating cultural exchange that would have been impossible without her Camp John-hei education. Tanaka Yuriko established one of the first private English schools in post-war Japan, teaching not just language, but the critical thinking skills she had learned alongside vocabulary and grammar. The resistance and resentment from some quarters of Japanese society toward these English-educated women revealed the threat they represented. They were accused of being contaminated by American thoughts, of being insufficiently Japanese, of threatening traditional values. Yet their English skills made them valuable in rebuilding Japan's international connections, in accessing global knowledge, in participating in worldwide academic and professional communities. The chalk they had held in Camp John-hei had marked them as different. But that difference became their strength in a globalizing world. The philosophical implications of the Camp John-hei English classes extended far beyond language acquisition. These women had experienced education as liberation rather than indoctrination, learning as choice rather than compulsion, knowledge as expansion rather than restriction. They had discovered that enemy knowledge didn't contaminate but enriched, that understanding others didn't diminish self but enhanced it. The chalk had written new possibilities into existence, possibilities that couldn't be unwritten, even when the women returned to societies that preferred their silence. Years later, At a 1955 reunion of Camp John Hay internees in Tokyo, the women who had learned English together reflected on their transformation. They spoke in a mixture of Japanese and English, code-switching fluidly between languages and, more importantly, between worldviews. Yamada Tomoko, who had become a translator for international businesses, observed, "The chalk gave us more than words. It gave us permission to think our own thoughts, to believe our ideas had value, to imagine ourselves as more than our roles. Every English word I learned was a small revolution. Every sentence I wrote was a declaration of intellectual independence." The American approach to prisoner education, exemplified by Lieutenant Williams and her chalk, represented democratic values in their most practical application. Education wasn't a privilege to be hoarded, but a right to be shared. Knowledge wasn't dangerous, but liberating. Individual growth wasn't threatening, but enriching to collective society. These principles, transmitted through simple English lessons, challenged authoritarian assumptions about information control, female capability, and human potential. The chalk traced more than letters on a board, it traced pathways to different futures. The contrast with Japanese military education couldn't have been starker. Where Japanese education had emphasized memorization, American teaching encouraged analysis. Where Japanese instruction had demanded conformity, American methods celebrated individual expression. Where Japanese schools had segregated by gender and restricted female learning, American classes mixed genders and encouraged female advancement. The chalk in female hands became a symbol of educational equality, a tool that worked the same regardless of who held it, that produced knowledge regardless of the writer's gender or nationality. The long-term impact on Japanese education was subtle but significant. The women who learned English at Camp John Hay became teachers, translators, and cultural bridges who introduced American pedagogical methods into Japanese classrooms. They asked students for opinions, encouraged creative writing, promoted critical thinking or revolutionary acts in traditional Japanese education. The chalk they wielded in post-war classrooms carried the DNA of their Camp John Hay experience, spreading democratic educational practices one lesson at a time. The preservation of their English notebooks, now housed in various peace museums and archives across Japan, testifies to the personal significance of this educational experience. These aren't just language exercises but documents of transformation, records of minds opening, evidence of individuals emerging from collective suppression. The pages still bearing chalk dust from 1945 are treated as historical artifacts, proof that even in prisoner of war camps, human potential could flourish when given opportunity and encouragement. The epilogue of this educational encounter extends to contemporary discussions about soft power, cultural exchange, and the role of education in democratization. The Camp John Hay English classes demonstrated that democratic values spread most effectively not through imposition, but through invitation, not through propaganda, but through practice. The chalk in Lieutenant Williams' hand was mightier than any sword, more transformative than any treaty, more lasting than any military victory. It wrote new possibilities into existence for women who had been taught their possibilities were predetermined and limited. Today, English education in Japan is ubiquitous, with millions of Japanese studying the language that was once forbidden as enemy contamination. Many don't know the history of women like Suzuki Haruko who risked social ostracism to learn English in American custody, who saw in that simple piece of chalk a tool for intellectual and personal liberation. Yet, their legacy lives in every Japanese woman who studies abroad, who publishes in English, who participates in global conversations as an equal voice. The chalk they held in 1945 continues writing new chapters in the ongoing story of cultural exchange and female empowerment. The fundamental truth revealed by the Camp John Hay English classes is that education, freely offered and voluntarily received, is democracy's most powerful tool. The chalk that traced English words on a makeshift blackboard in a prisoner of war camp became a wand of transformation, turning prisoners into students, students into thinkers, thinkers into independent individuals who would never again accept that their thoughts didn't matter. Lieutenant Williams probably never fully understood the revolution she initiated with her simple offer. English class all welcome, but the women who accepted that offer understood they were receiving more than language lessons. They were receiving recognition of their human capacity to learn, grow, and transform. The sound of chalk on blackboard, that simple squeak of compressed powder on painted wood, echoed through these women's lives for decades. It was the sound of possibility, of minds opening, of futures being rewritten. Every English word they learned was a small act of liberation. Every sentence they wrote was a claim to intellectual equality. Every story they told was an assertion of individual worth. The chalk had given them voices in a language that the whole world could hear. And once found, those voices would never again be silenced. In the end, the surprise of Japanese women POWs at being allowed to learn English reveals the profound difference between authoritarian and democratic approaches to human potential. Where one system saw danger in knowledge, the other saw opportunity. Where one feared educated women, the other encouraged them. Where one restricted learning to preserve power, the other shared learning to empower individuals. The chalk, that humble tool of education, became the instrument through which these differences were made manifest. Written in white powder on blackboards, traced in individual minds that would never forget the feeling of intellectual freedom once tasted the legacy of Camp John Hay's English. Classes lives not in grand monuments or official histories, but in the thousands of individual trajectories altered by education. Each woman who learned English there carried forward the radical idea that learning was a right, not a privilege, that education should expand rather than restrict thinking, that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to nations or governments. The chalk they held for those few months in 1945 to 1946 continued writing long after they left the camp, inscribing new possibilities into Japanese society, creating bridges between cultures that war had tried to make permanent enemies. The simple act of teaching English to enemy prisoners, of handing chalk to women who had been denied educational equality, of asking them to write their thoughts and stories, represented democracy not as abstract principle, but as daily practice. It showed that freedom wasn't just political but intellectual, that liberation wasn't just physical but mental, that victory wasn't measured in surrender documents, but in minds open to new possibilities. The chalk, in its humble simplicity, had accomplished what military force alone never could. It had transformed enemies into learners, prisoners into students, and ultimately isolated individuals into connected global citizens who understood that human potential transcends all boundaries that politics and war attempt to impose.